I will assume I'm starting now. The Cold War is a starting point for our talk tonight. For decades, there was stasis between the two blocs, the Soviet Union and the West. And the stasis was posited on massive conventional warfare. The West was frightened that the Soviet Union would attack through the Fulda Gap along the North German plains with massive conventional superiority, using tanks and heavy weaponry. And that was the geopolitical rationale for the Cold War, which lasted for 10 years, or I beg your pardon, for decades, in stasis with no real movement. But of course, the Cold War was complicated by the nuclear standoff, because after Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the world had become a different place. And what had been invented could not be unvented. The genie could not be put back in the bottle. Nuclear power was here to stay, military nuclear power. So that introduces a very high stakes element into the mix of military might, West and East. Now, during the development of the Cold War, each side obviously was striving to have the upper hand, and the development of nuclear power created a huge arms race. I want to talk to you a bit about mutually assured destruction, which was the basic doctrine behind what you might call 40 years of stability, which may or may not be a good thing, armed stability of that nature. The idea basically is that if you hit me, I will hit you back so much that you'll be dead. So you will kill me, but in so doing, I will kill you. It actually reminds me of a phrase in Shakespeare, strangely enough, where in Macbeth, at the beginning of Macbeth, the captain recalls the battle in which Macbeth overthrows the forces of Norway. And he talks about two spent swimmers that do cling together and choke their art. And that, in some ways, is what the West and the East were doing at those times. They were clinging together and choking their art, i.e. they were both sinking because they were going to destroy each other. Now, mutually assured destruction is a very complicated and weird thing. Basically, it is making an attack so unattractive to the opponent that he's not going to dare do it, and therefore he will just keep in his box with his arms folded. To be credible, obviously, mutually assured destruction has to rely on there being a big stick. You will recall that Teddy Roosevelt spoke about speaking quietly and carrying a big stick as the basis for his geopolitical stance. I beg your pardon? Talk softly. My American friend here is saying that we should talk softly rather than speak quietly. It's the same thing. What he meant was that you don't need to shout and scream if you have a big stick. And both the Soviet Union and the Western Alliance for decades had a very big stick in the form of nuclear weapons. The thing is, for mutually assured destruction to actually work, assuming that this crazy doctrine is something you want to pursue, it has to be based on credibility. So the enemy has to think, yes, my enemy over there has got sufficient weapons and the political will and the command and control system to actually use those weapons in the event that we launch our missiles against him. I'll come shortly to how this is dealt with in fiction, and we'll talk about a couple of films that deal with it in a very graphic fashion. I have 7 minutes left, this is good. We also have to base the readiness of forces which support mutually assured destruction on regular exercises. Because if you don't exercise your forces, you can't be sure they're actually going to be available and going to work when push comes to shove. Then there's another factor, which is strategic communication, what we call STRATCOM. Now, STRATCOM is a very complex and interesting idea, because the communication you have to ensure with the rest of the world and with your enemy primarily is, you hit us, we'll hit you so hard, you'll regret it. In fact, you won't live to regret it, you will die to regret it, if I might modify the common dictum. And so you have to communicate your abilities and your political will. And doing that is complex because, first of all, you have to strike the right balance between being belligerent and being reassuring. And secondly, you have not to reveal in your strategic communication too much about your own weaponry and about your own arsenal. If you do that, you are actually undermining your own power. So all this is extremely complex. And I would say that the strategic communication coming out of the White House these days, as I was saying at the beginning of my talk, is such that Russia is saying to itself, well, we can perhaps push a bit further. They won't react. They're too scared. There's not the will in that country anymore, and the Europeans are too disunited. So we can keep eating little portions of territory on the periphery of Western Europe. And maybe they're right. Maybe the Russian thinking is completely well-founded. And maybe if they continue to eat little parts of Estonia, Latvia, Kaliningrad, and Slovenia, we have a Slovenian colleague here, nobody will lift a finger to help them, possibly. I think not. I think luckily that the security guarantees inherent to the NATO treaty would mean that if the Russian Federation were to attack the Baltic states, which obviously used to belong to it in its own eyes, I think NATO would not be able not to act. Let's hope that will not come to pass. Now, I want to talk a bit about the nuts and bolts of deterrence. I know that you as interpreters love nuts and bolts. Oh, my finger's gone back to 0. I have 10 minutes again.
Oui, pardon de vous interrompre, Monsieur Guichot-Desfortis, mais nous n'avons que peu de temps pour l'ensemble des interventions. Je vous propose maintenant de passer à l'intervention de Mme Isha Dalaya. Et si d'éventuelles questions venaient après, bien sûr, nous reviendrons sur